In this next unit, we will be studying 3 African countries, and as always, it is important that we understand the historical background and some of the current issues that are affecting these countries. Africa is a huge continent, as you can see from this map, and we'll only be looking at a few countries. I suggest that you print a copy of this page so that you can identify the countries as they're discussed and also see their place in relationship to each other. First, we will be studying the Central African Republic, and there it is right in the center of Africa. See if you can find it. South Africa will follow, and it's also where you would expect, at the southern tip of Africa. The interesting thing about South Africa, just from the map, is that there are 2 separate countries that are inside its borders. We will also study Kenya on the east coast of Africa. It looks to me a little bit like Utah, if that will help you remember. And we will be introduced to Ghana on the west coast of Africa, sort of under the hump, as a prelude to the Caribbean. Ghana sort of looks to me like Fig Newton. 2 factors that have influenced Africa in immeasurable ways are the slave trade and the colonization of Africa. So we will look briefly at both of these as major determinants of the way African societies are today. I like this quote by Alikie Mbokolo because it provides the extent of the slave trade both across time and in numbers of people. The African continent has bled of its human resources via all possible routes. Across the Sahara, through the Red Sea, from the Indian Ocean ports, and across the Atlantic. At least 10 centuries of slavery for the benefit of Muslim countries, 4 million enslaved people via the Red Sea, another 4 million through Swahili ports of the Indian Ocean, and perhaps as many as 9 million along the trans-Saharan caravan routes. And that was all before the slave trades to the New Worlds. 11 to 20 million people, depending on the author, across the Atlantic Ocean during the 16th and 19th centuries. The consequence of the slave trade really was Africa's downfall. Both the eastern and the western slave trades depleted Africa of millions of black lives. These were men and women needed to plant crops, create technology, develop industries, run government, etc. It also turned African nations and peoples against each other, as greed and survival necessitated involvement in the slave trade. The amount of warfare and mistrust generated throughout this period is incalculable. Entire societies collapsed and disappeared altogether. The remnants of the slave trade you will be able to see in the instability in governments and in numerous ways in which African peoples have fought against each other and continue to this day. The few Africans who did manage to survive these holocausts, either by conspiring with the enemy or by fleeing to the interior, would be unable to escape Europe's second coming, which is colonization. The colonial conquest of Africa is a major barrier to the development of this continent. And it began in the 19th century with European industrialization. At that time, factories in Europe required raw materials to be manufactured into marketable products. As a result, Europeans sought sources of raw materials, as well as a market for manufactured goods. Politics in Europe also led to the colonization of Africa. Nationalism, which is a strong identification with and pride in one's nation, resulted in competition between European countries. This competition often resulted in wars, but it also was a competition over colonial expansion in Africa. No major nation in Europe in the 19th century wanted to be without colonies. So these two things together, plus the idea that many Europeans had that they were the most advanced civilization in the world, and they needed to therefore quote unquote enlighten and civilize other people, led to what has become known as the scramble for Africa. This began in 1884 when German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called together the major Western powers of the world at that time for a conference in Berlin. At that time, about 80% of Africa remained under traditional and local control, and only the coastal areas of Africa were colonized by European powers. The Berlin Conference lasted 3 months, while the European powers argued over how to divide up the entire continent of Africa. And that's what they did. They carved it up according to what they wanted. By 1905, some European power or another had laid claim to nearly every piece of African soil. Only Ethiopia and Liberia escaped. Colonial Africa was divided up among a host of European powers, including Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Belgium. The vast majority of these colonized nations did not receive independence until the 1950s and 60s. The Europeans now came not for people, but for the resources the continent held. The colonists came with new guns, new cannons, new methods with which to assault the slave trade weakened continent. Africans in the way of those invaders were either displaced, put to work, or killed. What ultimately resulted was a hodgepodge of geometric boundaries that divided Africa into 50 irregular countries. This new map of the continent was superimposed over the 1,000 indigenous cultures and regions of Africa. The new countries lacked rhyme or reason, and they divided coherent groups of people and merged them together with disparate groups who did not really get along. In this map you can see the handful of European countries color-coded on the map of Africa and what they controlled. You see Central African Republic would be right above where you see the Belgium Congo. It would be controlled by the French. In the south, you see South Africa's blue, Kenya's blue. On the west, Ghana's blue, all controlled by the British. But again, remember, they did this based on what they wanted, regardless of the language or cultures of the people who were involved in these places. Once claims were made and the borders were drawn for territories in Africa, the European nations had to come up with a plan for how to govern their newly acquired colonies. And there are basically 4 different types or ways in which they ruled the African colonies. The first was economic companies. In the early days, the European nations allowed the establishment of private companies that were granted large territories to administer in Africa. These companies were formed by businessmen who were interested in exploiting the natural resources of the territory they were allowed to govern. These companies set up their own systems of taxation and labor recruitment, and many of them were responsible for the expenses of establishing and administering the colonies, which of course was a good deal for the European countries because they got the political benefit without any of the expense. The British East Africa Company was established in 1888, and it colonized Kenya on behalf of Britain. It made treaties that claimed to offer protection to the various people of East Africa in exchange for recognition of the company's sovereignty by African rulers, and it ruled Kenya until 1893. One way that helps me to think about these companies would be like as if the U.S. government gave Bill Gates a country and said, okay, go and you can rule that country and use the resources for your company. So that's sort of how it worked. The British South African Company was established in 1887. It lasted a little bit longer than the East African Company. Using force and coercion, it colonized 3 territories: Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and governed these colonies until 1923. The French, Belgian, Germans, and Portuguese used direct rule in governing their African colonies. They had centralized administrations, usually in urban centers, that stressed assimilation and divide and conquer. Now, assimilation is when you force people to give up their own ethnic heritage and become like the people who they are being controlled by. So these groups tried to make Europeans out of the Africans that they had colonized. Another strategy was this divide and conquer, divide and rule, which meant that they implemented policies that intentionally weakened the indigenous power networks and institutions. Primarily, the British used indirect rule to govern their colonies. This system used indigenous African rulers within the colonial administration, even though they had an inferior role. Overall, it was more cooperative than the direct rule, but what happened was that it increased the ethnic divisions within the colony. This type of government assumed that all the Africans were organized by tribes with chiefs. However, this was not always the case. People in Africa had diverse types of government, ranging from highly centralized states to stateless societies. As a result, the indirect rule increased the divisions between ethnic groups and gave power to a certain few big men who had never had it before in pre-colonial history. Consequences of these significant changes in social organization and identity are still felt today. Settler rule refers to settlers who went to countries not just to visit, but to live, to make their home. Much like the settlers who came to America. They came to build a new place to live. These came mostly from Holland, Britain, Germany, and Portugal. And they colonized South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, and Namibia. In order to thrive in the colonies, the settlers demanded special political and economic rights and protection. Security and prosperity for the settlers depended on economic exploitation and political oppression of the African population that vastly outnumbered the settlers. Consequently, settler rule was characterized by its harsh policies towards the indigenous African populations. If you have seen the movie Out of Africa, for example, it is the story of a real-life person, Karen Blixen, who went to Africa and built a coffee plantation. Now, she was given or was able to buy land that was obviously Africans, But this is what the British did in Kenya. People who were close to the monarchy were given huge blocks of land. People who have money were sold blocks of land. And if you remember in that movie, at the end when she's leaving, she is very, very concerned about the Kikuyu who live on her land and what's going to happen to them, when the British leave. But this is an example of the settler rule, and we will see this in South Africa and the consequences. The practice of governing was somewhat different depending on the form of colonialism, but in spite of this, there were certain attributes that all the colonial governments shared. First of all, they were undemocratic. No matter what form colonial rule took, all colonial systems were undemocratic. Colonial governments did not allow popular participation. Decisions and policies were made with little input from the African people. Even in the case where decisions or policies may have benefited some people, they were still undemocratic since there was no mechanisms for people to officially express their opinions. Colonial rule was often imposed because it was imposed without consent of the African people. The prime objective was law and order, because understandably people weren't happy with being governed without any representation. So the colonial governments faced a lot of civil disobedience or outright resistance to their rule. So maintaining peace or law and order was a top priority. As a result, that's where the money was spent, on police and the military, in order to keep the order. The third item, the no infrastructure of social services. Well, the colonial governments weren't there to benefit the indigenous peoples, and they didn't really have money. They were there extracting riches from the land itself, but they weren't willing to put much back into it. And so this meant that colonial governance didn't provide basic infrastructure such as roads or communications networks, nor did they provide social services like education, healthcare, or housing. The fourth attribute of these governments was that all forms of colonial rule engaged in divide and rule by implementing policies that weakened the indigenous people, so that and the way that one of the ways that they did this was by separating groups who shared a language, religious or ethnic groups, and these policies that they created not only separated peoples but exacerbated the differences between people, which you can see why then later led to friction among people who were put in countries together but were different. Economic practice and legacy. One of the reasons for colonialism was the desire to gain control of Africa's rich natural resources. So while there were different types of colonial economies, similarities in practice centered on the exploitation of raw materials and the high demand for labor. Colonial regimes concentrated on finding and exploiting the most profitable natural resource in each colony. In mineral-rich colonies, the emphasis was placed on mining. In other territories, the colonial powers identified agricultural products suitable to export to Europe. In either case, the emphasis was on developing the resources for export, not for local use or consumption. Profit from the exports of mineral and agricultural goods were sent to Europe. Profits that could have been used to promote social and economic development in the colonies were not available. The small taxes levied on exports went to support colonial rule. Mining of minerals and the production of crops for export necessitated a ready supply of inexpensive labor. At times, colonial governments resorted to policies of forced labor in order to provide adequate labor for mines and plantations. At other times, their tactics were not as harsh, but in almost all situations, Africans labored in poor working conditions for long hours with inadequate pay. To improve the pay and working conditions of the laborers would have lessened profits. In most African colonies, very little was done officially to promote social change or social development. However, the colonial experience had a dramatic effect on African societies. Once again, it's important to remember that the colonial impact on Africa was not uniform across the continent. However, there were some social consequences that were experienced by most African colonies, and that is what you see listed. Economic and political practices often resulted in massive movements of people in the African colonies. Migrations were sometimes from one rural area to another, or other times from a rural to an urban area. These movements resulted in dislocation of people that impacted society and culture. Social beliefs and cultural practices were challenged by these migrations. Long-held practices had to be adapted and sometimes completely abandoned to fit new circumstances. And families were split up because of migration. When men had to work in mines or on plantations, they often had to leave families behind. As a result, women and adolescents were forced to take on new roles and to cope in the absence of husbands and fathers. And even when families weren't separated, they underwent considerable stress and change. Prior to colonialism, in fact, the extended family structure was the norm in Africa, but by the end of this era, the nuclear family was becoming the norm in many African countries. Another factor was urbanization. While there were towns and small cities in African societies, most people were engaged in agriculture and lived in rural areas or on homesteads. Again, when urbanization occurred very rapidly in African colonies, this challenged the existing values, beliefs, and social practices because it changed the economic activities, the occupations, and the way people lived. Colonialism also provided an environment for Christianity to spread. Now, Islam was widespread before colonialism, but it benefited as well. A very good novel that would give you insight into the role of missionaries is the book, The Poisonwood Bible. If you ever have an opportunity to read something just for fun, it is a wonderful book, and it really does give you a feeling for what missionary life was like in Africa. Finally, education. Most formal education was the work of missionaries. This was the really good thing that missionaries did in Africa, but obviously they couldn't serve all the children, and so most children could not go to school. At the end of the colonial era, only about half of the African children had finished elementary school, which was even smaller numbers for secondary school. As noted earlier, it was the 50s and 60s before African countries began to gain their independence. Libya and Egypt were the first nations. Ghana on the Gold Coast, which we'll talk about later, was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. In the 60s, 14 African countries gained independence, and by 1966, all but 6 were independent. You will note a handful in the 70s, Zimbabwe 80s, Namibia 90s, and note that South Africa only gained independence in 1994. By the time independence had been gained by the African countries, the realm had acquired a legacy of political fragmentation that could neither be eliminated nor made to operate satisfactorily. So the long-term consequences of the colonialism in Africa has been one of lack of development, instability, and often ethnic strife. And as if slavery and colonialism were not bad enough, HIV and AIDS is devastating Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is more heavily affected by HIV and AIDS than any other region in the world. As you see from the stats listed, almost 22.5 million people are living with AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is 2/3 of the global total. Almost 1.5 million people died from AIDS in 2008, and almost 2 million people became infected with HIV. More than 14 million children have lost one or both parents to HIV/AIDS in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. What is the effect of HIV infection in Sub-Saharan Africa? In the absence of massively expanded prevention, treatment, and care efforts, it is expected that AIDS death toll in Sub-Saharan Africa will continue to rise. This means the impact of the AIDS epidemic on these societies will be felt most strongly in the course of the next 10 years and beyond. Its social and economic consequences are already widely felt, not only in the health sector, but also in education, industry, agriculture, transport, human resources, and the economy in general. The AIDS epidemic in Sub-Saharan Africa threatens to devastate whole communities, rolling back decades of development progress. Sub-Saharan Africa now faces a triple challenge. One, providing health care, antiretroviral treatment, and support to the growing population of people with HIV-related illnesses. Reducing the annual toll of new HIV infections by enabling individuals to protect themselves and others. And lastly, coping with the impact of over 20 million AIDS deaths on orphans and other survivors, communities, and the national development. What kind of AIDS prevention is being used in Africa? Well, there are a number that you see below. HIV prevention initiatives have been conducted in a number of African countries in an effort to reduce the scale of their epidemics. Not all have been successful, but one example is the billboard that you see on the right, which is trying to educate people. Condom use. Condoms are play a key role in preventing HIV infection around the world. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, use and distribution has been increasing. However, in 2004, in Sub-Saharan Africa, there was only an average of the equivalent of 10 per man, which you can see it's not adequate. Mother-to-child transmission of HIV is a serious problem. Almost 400,000 children are becoming affected with HIV in 2008. The majority either during pregnancy, childbirth, or breastfeeding as a result of their mother being infected. Voluntary HIV counseling and testing is an important part of any national prevention program because it's widely recognized that people who are aware of their status are less likely to transmit it to others and to seek access to treatment, care, and support that can help them stay healthy longer. What is the impact of AIDS on Africa? In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, AIDS is erasing decades of progress made in extending life expectancy. Millions of adults are dying while they're still young or in middle age. Average life expectancy is now 47 years when it could have been 62 without AIDS. The effect on households can be very severe. Many families are losing their income earners. In other cases, people have to provide home-based care for sick relatives, reducing their capacity to earn money. Many of those dying from AIDS have surviving partners who themselves are infected and in need of care. They leave behind orphans, grieving and struggling to survive without a parent. Inevitably, the burden of coping rests with women who have to step up their roles as caregivers, income earners, and housekeepers. The epidemic has put a huge strain on the health sector, with the demand for care of those living with HIV rising, and as does the number of health care workers who are affected. Schools are heavily affected. This is a major concern because schools can play a vital role in reducing the impact of the epidemic through HIV education and support, but fewer children are receiving basic education as they are orphaned or forced into earning incomes or lose teachers to AIDS. All of this affects productivity, which in turn slows down economic activity and social progress. The vast majority of people living with HIV and AIDS in Africa are between 15 and 49, the prime years for earning a living. Employers, schools, factories, hospitals have to train staff to replace those in the workforce who become too ill to work. The HIV and AIDS epidemic has already significantly affected Africa's economic development, and in turn has affected Africa's ability to cope with the epidemic. What needs to be done to make a difference in Africa? One of the most important ways in which the situation in Africa can be improved is through increased funding for HIV/AIDS. More money would help improve prevention campaigns and provisions for treatment and care of those living with HIV. But in order to implement such programs, domestic commitment is needed. A country's health, education, and communication systems and infrastructures must be significantly developed. HIV-related stigma and discrimination remains an enormous barrier in the fight against AIDS. People fear of discrimination often prevents people from getting tested, seeking treatment, or admitting their HIV status publicly. AIDS education in Africa needs to be scaled up to combat the ignorance that causes people to discriminate. And lastly, in many parts of Africa, as elsewhere in the world, the AIDS epidemic is aggravated by social and economic inequalities between men and women. Women and girls commonly face discrimination in terms of access to education, employment, credit, health care, land, and inheritance. These factors can all put women in a position where they are particularly vulnerable to HIV infection. In sub-Saharan Africa, around 59% of those living with HIV are females. I know that this PowerPoint presentation is depressing, and it is depressing, but we can't understand the countries in Africa unless we understand this context. So I want you to keep this historical context in mind as you're reading the materials on Central African Republic, South Africa, and Kenya. There are a lot of ways in which there are evidence of the effects of HIV/AIDS and the legacy of slavery and colonialism in the facts, the history, as well as in the chapters. So look for these and note how these contextual factors in combination with others have produced different long-term consequences in the different countries that we're looking at.